So I want to start tonight with a small confession. I have been watching this show for most of my life. Longer than I've held most of my jobs, longer than I've lived in any one flat, longer than a few of the people I know have actually been alive. And the odd thing about loving something for that long, something that's been running since 1989 and has quietly piled up well over 700 episodes by now, is that eventually you stop watching it for the jokes. The jokes are still there. Most of them still land, which is its own small miracle. But after enough years, you start watching it the way you'd flip through an old family photo album. You stop looking for the punchlines and start looking for the moments where everything could have gone a slightly different way. Because here's the thing about Springfield that I find genuinely lovely, and we'll come back to it more than once tonight, so I won't labor it now. Nobody there ever gets any older. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa is permanently 8. Maggie's been working away at that pacifier since around the time the Berlin Wall came down, and she's no closer to finishing. The whole town gets flattened, rebuilt, reset, scandalized, and then wakes up the following week with no memory of a single bit of it. And what that actually means, if you sit with it for a second, is that every choice anyone in that town has ever made is still just sitting there, frozen, never quite resolved. You can reach in and pick up any one of them and ask the simplest question there is. What if it had gone the other way? That's the whole plan for tonight. There's nothing you need to brace for. No big reveal at the end, no twist I'm building toward, no part where I tell you to pay attention because this next bit is important. It isn't a documentary, it's more like sitting up far too late with someone who knows a daft amount about a thing they love, letting them ramble. We're going to take a handful of quiet little moments from the show, real ones, things that genuinely happened in episodes that genuinely aired, where Springfield could have tipped off in some completely different direction. And then we'll follow each thread a little way down its road and see where it might have wandered. You don't need to remember the episodes, you don't need to have seen them, you honestly don't even need to stay awake. If you nod off somewhere around the third or fourth one, that's rather the idea. None of these roads are going anywhere. They'll keep perfectly well whether you're listening to the end or not. And if this is your sort of thing, the slow wander through a show I'm far too fond of, there's a subscribe button knocking about somewhere, and it'd be nice to have you along. That's the only time I'll bring it up though. I'm not going to keep nudging you between every section like a man selling you a timeshare. That would rather defeat the point of the exercise. Right, settle in. Get comfortable. Let's start with the one I think about most, which is, of all things, a bowling alley. There's a plaque in this episode that I genuinely cannot think about without going a bit soft in the head. It's bolted up next to Homer's workstation at the power plant, and it reads in big stern letters, "Don't forget, you're here forever." Mr. Burns put it there on purpose, as a sort of little daily reminder that Homer is trapped, that there's no way out, that this grim beige room with its blinking buttons is the whole of the rest of his life. It's a deeply nasty thing to hang on a man's wall. And by the end of the episode, Homer has quietly covered bits of it with photographs of his baby daughter, arranged so carefully that the words now read, "Do it for her." That's it. That's the whole gag. Except it isn't a gag at all. It's the single most moving thing this cartoon has ever done. And it happens in an episode about a bowling alley. The episode's called "And Maggie Makes 3. It aired in early 1995, and it tells you finally why there are no baby photos of Maggie in the family album. The answer is that they're all at the plant, taped around that plaque. But the bit I keep circling back to is what comes before, because there's this stretch of the episode where Homer actually gets out. He's been chipping away at his debts for ages, careful with money for once in his life, and one day he gets a paycheck that clears the last of it. And the first thing he does, the very first thing, is quit. He walks out of that plant, calls Mr. Burns a bongo head, plays his bald skull like a drum, and goes off to take the job he's always wanted, which is working at Barney's Bowl-O-Rama. Less money, far less stress, a friendly little world of regulars and rented shoes, and that particular smell that bowling alleys have. And for a while, it works. The maths just about holds. 4 of them getting by, Homer genuinely happy for once. And then Marge gets pregnant with Maggie, and the whole thing falls apart because a bowling alley wage won't stretch to a family of 5. So he tries everything. He even, in a move I find both insane and completely in character, attempts to drum up business by firing a shotgun into the air outside the alley and shouting at passersby to come bowling. This does not work. It mostly attracts the police. And in the end, he has to crawl back to the plant through a literal dusty dog flap and beg Burns for his old job, which is when the plaque goes up. So here's the road not taken. What if the maths had held? What if Maggie had come along a year later, or the alley had done a bit better, or Homer had simply been allowed to keep the one job he ever actually loved? It's a gentler timeline than you'd think, and also a quietly impossible one. Because the strange truth about this show is that nearly all of it depends on Homer being in exactly that building. The plant is where Mr. Burns lives, and Burns is the closest thing Springfield has to a proper villain. So without Homer there as his put-upon safety inspector, half the show's machinery has nowhere to turn. Lenny and Carl are work friends. They only exist in Homer's life because of that control room. Smithers, Burns, the whole grim corporate comedy of it, all of that needs Homer clocked in. Take him out and put him behind a shoe counter, and Springfield loses its engine without quite realizing it has. I think about the version of Homer who works at that bowling alley a lot, actually. He'd be poorer. The house would feel it. There'd be fewer of those episodes where the family suddenly has money and then loses it again by the closing credits, because a man at a bowling alley doesn't accidentally become an astronaut or win a Grammy or get sent to space. He just racks up the pins and goes home. But he'd be lighter, I think. There's a looseness to Homer in those brief alley scenes that you don't really see anywhere else. He's not dreading Monday, he's just a bloke who likes his job, which is a rarer thing on television than you'd expect. And here's the part that gets me. The show could have given him that. It would have been the kind thing to do. Instead, it took the dream away, sent him back through the dog flap, hung the cruelest possible sign over his desk, and then turned that exact cruelty into the most tender image in its entire run. A man covering the words, "You're here forever," with pictures of his daughter until they say, "Do it for her." He didn't get the life he wanted. He got Maggie instead. And the show's whole quiet argument, the one it keeps making over and over, whether you notice or not, is that this was somehow the better trade. I don't fully believe it. Part of me will always want Homer to have kept that bowling alley. But I understand why the show doesn't agree with me. That's a strange thing for a cartoon to be able to do to a person at 1 a.m, and yet here we are. Let's talk a bit about the most powerful man in Springfield being taken down by a baby and a lollipop, because I don't think it gets enough credit for how strange a thing that is. You probably know the broad shape of it, even if you've never seen the episodes. For one summer in 1995, this was genuinely a thing the whole world was chewing on. The show ended its 6th season with Mr. Burns getting shot by a person unknown, slumped over a sundial in the dark, and then made everyone wait the entire summer to find out who did it. There was a competition. There was, if you can believe it, a phone line. People had theories, and when the answer finally came in the next season's opener, it turned out the assailant, the shadowy gunman who'd felled the richest, cruelest, most calculating man in town, was Maggie, the 1-year-old, the one who can't talk. The way it happens is so daft and so perfect that I have a lot of affection for it. Burns, having spent the whole story trying to block out the sun so the town would have to buy more of his electricity, which is a genuinely supervillain thing to attempt, spots Maggie sitting in the family car with a lollipop. And he decides, in a fit of pettiness, that he is going to take candy from a baby. Literally, he goes for the lolly. There's a struggle, which he loses because he is a frail 100-year-old man, and she is a determined infant. And in the scuffle, his own gun slips out of his coat, lands in her hands, and goes off. That's it. That's how the great Monty Burns gets shot. He tried to nick a sweet off a toddler and it backfired, in the most literal sense available. He survives, of course. He always survives. And the official reason he survives is delightfully cynical. There was no version of this where the show could actually lose Mr. Burns because you simply cannot send a baby to prison, and the writers knew it. Making Maggie the shooter was the one solution that let them stage the most famous cliffhanger on television and then put absolutely everything back exactly where it was. Chief Wiggum even says it out loud. No jury would convict a baby. Marge calls it an accident. And then there's that one last shot of Maggie's eyes narrowing just for a frame, as if to suggest she knew precisely what she was doing, which the show has the good sense never to explain. But tonight we're not here for the version where he lives. We're here for the road where the gun does its work and Mr. Burns doesn't get back up. And the first thing you notice, walking down that road, is how much of Springfield is quietly load-bearing on this one ancient man. He owns the power plant, which is the town's largest employer, which means he indirectly owns a good chunk of everyone's livelihood. He owns favors, debts, secrets. He's been around so long, he remembers things no one else does. Take him out of the picture, and the plant doesn't just lose a boss, it loses the gravitational center it's been orbiting for a century. Who runs it? Smithers can't. Smithers is devoted, brilliant at his job, and completely lost without someone to be devoted to. His whole identity is built around serving Burns, and a Smithers without Burns is a man whose entire reason for getting up in the morning has been switched off. I find that genuinely sad to think about, more than the death itself, honestly. The villain dying is one thing, the man who loved him being left with nothing to love is another. And the comedy of the show would have a real hole in it too, because Burns is its proper villain. Not its most frequent threat, that's probably Bart's own bad decisions, but its grandest. He's the show's Dracula. He's the one who'll release the hounds, block out the sun, recoil from a moth like it's a dragon. Sideshow Bob is a wonderful villain, but he's a guest. He comes and goes. Burns is the furniture. He's the thing the show pushes against when it wants to say something about money or power or the particular way the very old and very rich seem to exist slightly outside the rules the rest of us live under. Lose him, and Springfield is a softer place, but it's also a place with nothing solid to shove against. There's a wonderful little speech Smithers gives at one point, trying to make sense of how far Burns went with the sun thing. He says, more or less, that Burns became so consumed by greed he'd steal from anyone, and that when he tried to steal the town's sunlight, he crossed the line from everyday villainy into proper cartoon supervillainy. And I love that because it's the show being honest about its own machinery. It knows Burns is a cartoon. It knows he's ridiculous. But it also knows that a town needs a shape for the thing it's afraid of. And Burns is that shape. He's fear you can laugh at. He's the worst impulses of wealth, wearing a suit 2 sizes too big and recoiling from sunlight. So in the timeline where Maggie's shot lands true, Springfield gets to be kinder and ends up emptier. The plant carries on under someone duller. The town loses its favorite thing to hate, which is a stranger loss than it sounds, because hating Burns was a thing the whole town did together. And somewhere in a big, cold mansion, a man named Waylon Smithers wakes up every morning with nobody to bring coffee to. And that, to me, is the saddest room in the whole imaginary timeline. It's funny, the show built this enormous mystery, ran it as a genuine global event, and then resolved it in the one way that guaranteed nothing would actually change. A baby did it, so no one's responsible, so the world resets. And you can read that as a cop-out. Plenty of people did at the time. But I think there's something almost touching in it. The show looked at the chance to kill its greatest villain, had the whole world watching, and decided it would rather keep him. Even a monster, it turns out, is worth holding on to if you've grown fond enough of the shape he makes. Let's pause there for a moment. No reason really. There's no rush to get anywhere tonight. If you're still with me, you might have noticed the thing that makes all of this possible. The thing I said we'd keep coming back to. None of these roads close. In a normal story, a choice gets made and the door behind it shuts, and you never get to see the other side. But Springfield doesn't work like that. It never moves forward, so it never throws anything away. Every version of every character is still just hanging there in the air, equally true, none of them ever quite happening. It's a bit like a house where nobody ever leaves and nobody ever dies, and the calendar on the wall stays on the same month for decade after decade. Slightly haunting if you think about it too hard. Very cozy if you don't. So let's not think about it too hard. Let's just wander on to the next one. This time we're going back to a school detention room in the 70s, where two teenagers who couldn't be more different ended up in the same room at the same time, and the whole show quietly began. Here's a detail I find lovely. Homer and Marge met in detention. Not at a party, not through friends, not across a crowded room. In detention at Springfield High, sometime in the mid-70s, both of them in trouble for entirely different reasons. The episode that tells this story is called The Way We Was from the show's second season, and it's one of the first times the show stopped being purely a joke machine and let itself just be tender for 20 minutes. Homer was there for more or less being Homer. Marge was there for something far more interesting. She'd burned a bra in protest, which tells you that the young Marge had a fire in her that the patient, raspy-voiced mum we know mostly keeps bank these days. And these two, the slacker and the idealist, ended up sat in the same dull room watching the same clock, and against every reasonable expectation, something started. But there was a third person in this story, and his name was Artie Ziff. Artie was the smart one, the one with prospects. He was sharp, articulate, going places, the kind of boy a sensible family would be thrilled to see their daughter bring home. And for a while, it genuinely looked like Marge would end up with him. He asked her to the prom, she said yes. Homer, who'd fallen for her completely and had no business even being in the running, ended up going to the prom alone, watching the girl he loved on the arm of a boy who was, by every measurable standard, the better bet. And Marge chose Homer anyway. Not at the prom, that night actually went to Artie. But afterwards, when Artie showed himself to be a bit handsy and a lot self-absorbed, and Homer was just standing there being kind and hopeless in hers, she chose the hopeless one. She walked away from the prospects and toward the lump. And that single decision, made by a teenager in the 70s, is the soil the entire show grows out of. So, what if she'd stuck with Artie? The show actually went back and poked at this itself years later in an episode where Artie turns up again, fabulously rich now, and offers Marge a chance to imagine the life she didn't take. Which tells me the writers were just as haunted by the question as I am, because the road where Marge marries Artie Ziff is, on paper, the sensible one. She'd have money, comfort, a husband who could hold a conversation about something other than beer and television, the big house, the nice things, the stability that the actual Simpson household never quite manages to hold on to for more than one episode at a time. And it would be hollow. That's the thing the show is absolutely certain about, even when I'm not. Artie's defining trait, the one that never changes no matter how rich he gets, is that he's fundamentally in love with himself. Marge would be an accessory in that marriage, a very well-kept one, but an accessory, whereas Homer, for all his enormous and well-documented failings, actually sees her. He needs her in a way that's sometimes a bit much, frankly, but underneath the neediness there's real devotion. Homer would, and repeatedly does, walk through fire for Marge and the kids. Artie would walk through fire for Artie and expect Marge to hold his coat. But here's where the thread gets properly strange, and it's the same problem we keep running into. There are no Simpson children in this timeline. Not the ones we know. Bart, Lisa, Maggie, they're specifically the children of Homer and Marge. They're made of both of them. Bart's mischief and his hidden soft heart. Lisa's idealism that came straight from the bra-burning teenager Marge used to be. Maggie's quiet watchfulness. A Marge and Artie household produces different children, or no children, or children we'd never recognize. The whole show in this timeline simply isn't there. You've traded the entire thing for a nice house and a man who'd correct your grammar. And that, I think, is the actual point the show is making, the one it keeps making over and over in different costumes. It's making the case for the wrong choice, or rather, the choice that looks wrong on paper and turns out to be the only right one. Marge could have had the comfortable life. Every sensible instinct, every concerned parent, every spreadsheet would have pointed her at Artie. And she looked at all of that and picked the loud, daft, loving disaster instead and built something real with him. Poorer, messier, far more chaotic, and real. I think about how rare it is for a show to be that clear-eyed about love. Most stories tell you love is about finding the best person. This one quietly insists it's about choosing the right one, and that those aren't remotely the same thing. Artie was, by almost any metric, the better person to marry. Homer was the right one. And Marge, who was sharper and braver as a teenager than the show sometimes lets us remember, knew the difference before she was even out of high school. There's a small, sad footnote to all this, which is that Artie never really got over it. The later episode makes that plain. He spent his whole life becoming the success he always promised he'd be. And at the end of it, he's still a bit lonely, still circling back to the one girl who looked at everything he had to offer and gently said, "No, thank you." He's not a villain in any of this. He's just a man who was the better bet and lost anyway, to a fellow who had nothing going for him except that he meant it. And maybe that's the kindest way to think about the road not taken here. Somewhere off in the timeline that never happened, Marge has the big house and the good crockery and a husband who's never once embarrassed her in public. And she's bored out of her mind, and she doesn't even know why, because she has everything a person is supposed to want. The trouble is, she gave up the one thing she actually did. I'd take the chaos. I think she would too. I think, deep down, that's exactly what she decided in that detention room. Watching a hopeless boy fall for her all those frozen years ago. This one's a bit different from the others because to understand the road not taken, you have to understand that the show was, for once, arguing with itself. Most episodes of this program don't really question their own logic. They can't, or there'd be no show. You have to simply accept that Homer is a nuclear safety inspector who causes a meltdown roughly once a month and never gets fired. That he's been fired and rehired more times than anyone could count. That he survives falls and explosions and electrocutions that would flatten a normal man, and that none of it ever sticks. That's the deal. You sign it when you start watching. But in 1997, the show made one episode where a character showed up who had not signed the deal, and it's one of the most uncomfortable, fascinating things it ever produced. The episode's called Homer's Enemy, and the character is Frank Grimes. Grimes is, in a way, the only realistic person who ever set foot in Springfield. His backstory is genuinely grim. Abandoned by his parents at 4, never went to school, taught himself everything, worked hard every single day of his life for almost nothing, clawed his way to a respectable job through sheer grinding effort. Mr. Burns sees him on the news in a human interest piece about a man who pulled himself up by his bootstraps, is briefly moved, and hires him at the plant. And then Grimes meets Homer, and Homer breaks his brain, because here's a man who's the opposite of everything Grimes spent his whole life believing in. Homer is lazy, incompetent, dangerous at his job, and he has a loving wife, 3 kids, a house he owns, 2 cars, a dog, friends, and somehow no consequences for any of it. He's been to space, he's met presidents, he has framed on his wall photos of himself with celebrities. To Grimes, who earned every scrap he ever had, this is an obscenity. It violates the one rule he organized his entire existence around, which is that effort is supposed to mean something. And it kills him, not metaphorically. Grimes, by the end, has worked himself into such a fury at the unfairness of Homer's charmed life that he loses it completely. Goes tearing through the plant, mockingly imitating Homer, eating like a slob, behaving recklessly, shouting that he's Homer Simpson, And he can do whatever he likes, and in the middle of this, he grabs a pair of high-voltage cables with his bare hands, sneering that he doesn't need safety gloves because he's Homer Simpson. Except he isn't. He's a normal man. And a normal man who grabs those cables dies, which he does instantly. And then, in the cruelest button the show ever wrote, Homer falls asleep at the funeral, mutters something daft in his sleep, everyone laughs, and Grimes gets lowered into the ground while the town chuckles at the very man who, in a sense, killed him. So, the road. What if Grimes had lived? What if he'd pulled his hands back at the last second, gone home, calmed down, and stayed in Springfield as a permanent character? The one man who knows, and will never stop knowing, that the rules here are broken. And the honest answer is that I don't think the universe could hold him. That's what the episode is really about, underneath the discomfort. It's not that Grimes is wrong, he's completely right. Homer genuinely is given more than he deserves. The show's logic genuinely is unfair. Effort genuinely doesn't reliably pay off in Springfield. The problem is that Grimes is right about a place that simply does not run on being right. He's a documentary character who's wandered into a cartoon, and the cartoon has its own physics, and they will not bend for him. A living Grimes would have to spend every single day watching Homer fail upward and not be allowed to die at the end of it, which is arguably a worse fate than the one he got. I have a lot of sympathy for him, more than the show really lets you have in the moment. Because Grimes isn't a villain, he's just a man who believed the things we're all told to believe. Work hard, play fair, and good things will come. And then got dropped into the one place in the world where none of that is true, and was driven mad by the gap. The show calls the episode Homer's Enemy, but Grimes isn't really Homer's enemy. He's the enemy of the show's entire premise. He's what happens when you let one person look directly at the machinery. And there's something almost brave about the show building him at all. It's a program that knows exactly what it is. It knows Homer shouldn't get away with any of it. It built a whole character whose only job was to stand in the middle of Springfield and say, out loud, "This is insane, none of this should work, why does this idiot have everything?" And then it killed him, not to silence him exactly, but because there genuinely was no place for him to go. You can't fix the rules of Springfield, you can only survive them, and survival in Springfield requires not noticing how strange it all is. Grimes noticed. That was the one thing he couldn't afford to do. So the road where Frank Grimes lives isn't really a happy one. It's a man condemned to be permanently correct in a world that runs on not caring whether you're correct. Maybe the kindest thing the show did was not make him live through that. I think about him more than I think about most of the actual recurring characters, this man who only appeared once. He's the ghost the show carries around, the proof that it knew, the whole time, exactly what it was getting away with. There's an object I want to talk about, and it's that battered baritone saxophone Lisa carries around. You've heard it even if you've never watched an episode, because it's woven into the theme tune. That little squawking solo at the end of the credits is Lisa going off script. And I never really thought about where the thing came from until I saw the episode that explains it. And now I can't stop thinking about it. The episode's called Lisa's Sax, and it tells you how she got it. The short version is that Homer bought it for her. The longer version is the one that gets me. The family had finally saved up enough for an air conditioner, and you have to understand, in that house, in that heat, in that constant low-grade financial panic, an air conditioner is a genuine luxury, a real bit of comfort they almost never get. And around the same time, Homer started to clock that his daughter wasn't like other kids, that she was bright in a way the school wasn't built to handle, that she was a bit sad, a bit alone, that she had something inside her with no way to get out. And he took the air conditioner money, the comfort money, the money for the thing the whole family wanted, and he spent it on a saxophone for Lisa, so she'd have somewhere to put it all. Now Homer does not understand Lisa. This is a permanent feature of the show, not a temporary one. He doesn't get her politics, her vegetarianism, her music, her sadness, her brain. They are on nearly every axis completely baffling to each other. And that's exactly what makes this such a quietly enormous thing for him to have done. He didn't understand what she needed. He just understood that she needed something and that he could give it to her, and that it would cost the family their one bit of comfort. And he did it anyway, without being asked, without really being able to explain why. So here's the road. What if he hadn't? What if the air conditioner won? What if Homer, who'd have been entirely within his rights to want a cool house for once, had bought the sensible thing and Lisa had stayed saxless? And I think this is one of the quietly saddest roads we'll walk tonight because of how much of Lisa hangs off that one instrument. The saxophone isn't just a hobby for her, it's her voice. It's the thing she reaches for when the words won't come, when the family doesn't understand her, when she's the only person in the room who can see what's wrong with the room. There are whole episodes built around the idea that the sax is how Lisa survives being Lisa, being too clever and too sensitive and too aware in a town and a family that mostly aren't. Take it away and you don't lose a plot device. You lose her pressure valve. A Lisa without that outlet is a more bottled up Lisa. Sharper, maybe, but lonelier with all that feeling and intelligence and frustration and nowhere to send it. Music is the one place she gets to be unguarded. It's where she connects with the people the rest of the show doesn't have time for, the sad old jazz musicians, the ones who understand being gifted and overlooked at the same time. Without the sax, those threads don't exist. She'd still be brilliant, she'd still be good. But she'd have one fewer way to be heard, and being heard is the thing Lisa is always short of. What I keep landing on, though, is the relationship the saxophone quietly builds between her and Homer. Because here's the lovely paradox of it. The man who understands her least gave her the thing that lets her be most herself. He can't follow a word of her saxophone solos. He'd probably prefer she played something with a tune he recognized. And he bought it for her anyway, and every time she plays it, that's him in the room with her, even when neither of them would put it that way. It's love that didn't need to understand itself to be real, which is, when you think about it, the most Homer thing imaginable. He gets almost everything wrong, and then every so often, with no warning and no explanation, he gets the one thing that matters completely right. I don't think Lisa knows how close she came to not having it. I don't think Homer thinks about it much either. He's not the type to keep a ledger of his own good deeds. He barely keeps a ledger of his own bad ones. But somewhere in the version of the show that never aired, there's a Lisa with no saxophone and a slightly cooler house. And she's a little quieter, a little more alone, carrying all of it around inside with nowhere to set it down. And I'm glad that's not the one we got. The man chose the sax over the air conditioner. He chose his strange, difficult, wonderful daughter over his own comfort, and he never once asked for credit. That's the whole show, really, smuggled into a single purchase. He didn't understand her. He just refused to let her go unheard. I want to tell you about the only boss who ever actually appreciated Homer Simpson, and the small heartbreak of the fact that he was a supervillain. His name is Hank Scorpio, and he turns up in an episode called You Only Move Twice. The setup is that Homer gets properly headhunted for the first time in his life by a company called Globex. And to take the job, the whole family has to relocate to a purpose-built town called Cypress Creek. And Scorpio is Homer's new boss, and he is, without exaggeration, the best boss in the history of the show, possibly the best boss in the history of television. He's warm, he's encouraging, he learns Homer's name and actually uses it. He puts an arm around him, asks how he's doing, and waits for the answer, gives him real responsibility, and tells him he's doing brilliantly. He hands Homer a job running the company's hammock division and lets him discover that he's good at it, that people respect him, that he can lead. For the first time ever, Homer goes to work and is happy and valued and seen. The joke, of course, the joke that makes the whole thing sing, is that Hank Scorpio is also a Bond villain. He's plotting to take over the eastern seaboard with a doomsday device. There are men in jumpsuits with flamethrowers running about. He casually has people killed mid-conversation while being unfailingly lovely to Homer. And Homer doesn't notice any of it because Homer has never in his life been treated this well. And a man being treated well for the first time is not inclined to ask too many questions about the flamethrowers. Here's the catch, and it's the whole episode in miniature. Homer thrives in Cypress Creek, and everyone else in the family quietly falls apart. Marge has a beautiful house with nothing to do in it and starts drinking wine in the afternoon out of sheer boredom. Bart gets put in the remedial class and is humiliated. Lisa is allergic to basically the entire local plant life and is miserable. So the family is wretched, and Homer is having the best week of his working life, and he has to choose. And he chooses them. He gives up the one job where he was ever genuinely respected, the one boss who ever genuinely valued him, and moves everyone back to Springfield, back to the plant, back to Mr. Burns, who can't even remember his name. So, the road. What if they'd stayed? What if the family had toughed it out, found their feet, and Homer had got to keep the life where he mattered? It's tempting, isn't it? Because Homer deserves that. Of all the people on the show, he's the one most starved of basic professional dignity, and Scorpio hands it to him on a plate. A version of Homer who stays in Cypress Creek is a Homer with self-respect, with a job he's good at, with a boss who believes in him. You could almost cry about how much that would mean to him. And it would also gently and completely end the show, because the show isn't really about the Simpson family in the abstract. It's about the Simpson family in Springfield. The town is the other main character. It's the plant, and Mose, and the church, and the school, and Ned next door, and the whole tangled web of people Homer's been failing to impress for decades. Pull the family out of that web and drop them in a shiny new town full of strangers, and you've got a different program entirely. One with no history, no Lenny, no Barney, no Flanders to covet, no Burns to resent. That's the quiet thing this episode understands about the show it's part of. Homer's misery at the plant is load-bearing. The town that doesn't appreciate him is the town that made him who he is. Cypress Creek is better for Homer and worse for everyone, including, in a strange way, Homer himself, because the version of him that gets everything he wants would no longer be the version we recognize. He'd be content, and content isn't a thing this show really knows how to do for more than about 90 seconds before something has to go wrong. What stays with me, though, is Scorpio, because the kindest figure in Homer's entire working life was a man trying to hold the world hostage, and the show never lets Homer find that out. As far as Homer's concerned, he just had one good boss once for a little while in a town he had to leave for his family's sake. He doesn't know Scorpio was a monster. He just remembers being happy. And there's something almost unbearably sweet about that the best week of Homer's career was real to him, was a genuine kindness, even though the man delivering it was simultaneously arranging a coup. The flamethrowers didn't make the warmth fake. Homer got to feel valued properly once. He just had to give it back because the people he loved were drowning in the nice house. And Homer, whatever else you want to say about him, has always known which of those two things matters more. So they came home, back to the town that doesn't appreciate him, the boss who can't recall his name, the plant with the cruel plaque. And honestly, I think that's where the show needed them. But I'll always have a soft spot for the road where Homer stayed in his hammock division, the boss of something at last, never once suspecting that the lovely man in the next office was about to be the most wanted criminal in the country. He was happy. For one episode, Homer Simpson got to be happy at work. The show couldn't allow it to last, but I'm glad it let it happen at all. This one starts somewhere odd, which is a contract dispute. Stay with me. Because it's one of the few times the real world reached into Springfield and rearranged the furniture for keeps. For most of the show's early run, Ned Flanders had a wife called Maud. She was sweet, devout, a bit of a wet blanket, the perfect partner for Ned in his relentless, cheerful piety. She was a minor character, the sort who's there in the background of 100 scenes without ever quite getting a storyline of her own. And then, in an episode from the year 2000 called Alone Again Natura Diddly, she died. The way it happens is grimly silly, which is very much the house style. She's at a motor speedway, leans over a railing, and gets knocked clean off the grandstand by a barrage of t-shirts fired from a cannon. A t-shirt cannon. That's how Maud Flanders goes. Now, the reason behind it had nothing to do with the story. The actress who voiced Maud, Maggie Roswell, had a pay dispute with the show. She'd actually moved away and was recording her lines remotely, and the money on offer wasn't covering the travel, and it all came to a head. So the writers, rather than keep Maud as an ongoing character, decided to write the character out permanently. And because they wrote her out by killing her, they did something the show almost never does. They let it stick. That's the thing I keep turning over. This is a program whose entire identity is that nothing sticks. People come back from the dead, the town resets, continuity is a suggestion rather than a rule. And yet Maud stayed dead. Ned remarried Edna Krabappel before becoming a widower again. It became one of the load-bearing facts of the back half of the show. The grief, the loneliness, the awkward dating episodes, the way it deepened Ned from a one-note goody-goody into a man who'd actually lost something. A behind-the-scenes squabble about travel expenses became permanent canon in a universe that doesn't believe in permanence. Pretty remarkable when you put it like that. So the road tonight is the simple one. What if the dispute had been settled? What if Maud had never leaned over that railing and Ned had stayed a married man? And it's a gentler Springfield, but a shallower Ned, because Maud's death is, oddly, one of the most consequential things that ever happened to a supporting character on this show. Before it, Ned is mostly a foil, the impossibly perfect neighbor whose whole function is to make Homer feel inadequate by comparison. Nice house, nice wife, nice kids, nice faith, and Homer seething with envy over the fence. After it, Ned is a man holding his life together with prayer and willpower after the universe knocked his wife off a grandstand for no reason at all. It gave him a wound. It made him a person. There's a whole later episode, Hurricane Neddy, about how much rage and pain Ned has been suppressing his whole life, but it's Maud's death that really cashes that in, that turns the cheerful churchgoer into someone you can imagine actually lying awake at night. A Ned who keeps Maud is a Ned who stays a foil, comfortable, two-dimensional, forever the smug contrast to the chaos next door. Lose Maud and the show loses its easy joke. Keep her and you never get the version of Ned who has to figure out how to raise his boys alone, how to love God after God let this happen, how to be lonely in a town full of people. I'm not going to pretend the show always handled that gracefully. It didn't, not always. But the depth was there to draw on, and it only existed because of an accident that started with a row about expenses. There's something I find quietly moving about a death that's stuck in a world where nothing else does. Everywhere else in Springfield, loss is temporary. You can be shot, blown up, eaten, erased, and you'll be fine by next week. But not Maud. Maud Flanders is permanently dead, and Ned Flanders eventually becomes a widower again. It's almost like the show decided that if it was only ever going to let one ordinary loss be real and permanent, it would be this one. The quiet wife of the annoying neighbor knocked off a railing by a t-shirt cannon, mourned by a man who'd spent his whole life being too nice to ever properly grieve anything. So in the road where she lives, Ned's happier and smaller, the town's gentler and less true. And somewhere a voice actress got a fairer deal and a fictional marriage survived because of it, which is a strange and lovely thing to be able to say about a cartoon. But the road we actually got is the one where a minor character's death became one of the few permanent things in a world built to forget. I think Ned's better for it in the way that grief makes people deeper, even as it hollows them out. I'm just not sure he'd agree with me. He'd probably rather have Maud. Most of us would rather have the person than the depth their absence carved into us. That's rather the whole problem with grief, isn't it? Right, I'll be honest, a couple of those got a bit melancholy, didn't they? The widower, the dead wife, the man who's permanently correct in a world that doesn't care. I didn't fully mean for it to drift that way, but that's the thing about a show that's been running this long. You go looking for the funny what-ifs, and you keep tripping over the sad ones. So let's lighten up for a while. The next few roads are a bit more fun, a bit more daft. We've got a villain who keeps stepping on rakes, a boy crying over a history test, a Grammy-winning barbershop quartet, and the saddest teddy bear in television history. All right, that last one isn't lighter, I'll admit, but we'll get there gently. Whatever you're doing right now, lying in the dark, half listening, somewhere between awake and not, you don't have to follow any of it closely. Let it go by like scenery from a train window. Here's the next one. It's about a man who has, no exaggeration, spent decades of his life trying to murder a 10-year-old, and somehow remains one of the most likable characters on the show. Let me start with the rakes, because they're perfect, and I will never get tired of them. There's a sequence in an episode called Cape Fears where Sideshow Bob, mid-pursuit, steps on a rake. The handle flips up and smacks him in the face. He growls, that low, irritated grumble of his, and steps forward and steps on another rake. Smack and another, smack. And the show just keeps going, rake after rake after rake, well past the point where it's funny until it loops all the way back round and becomes funny again on a completely different level. It's one of the most famous gags in the whole series, and it's famous precisely because it's a man whose entire being is wounded dignity, reduced to getting repeatedly hit in the face by garden tools. And that's the genius of Sideshow Bob, this tension that never resolves. Because on paper, Bob is genuinely terrifying. He's a highly intelligent, classically educated Yale graduate sociopath with a beautiful speaking voice and a singular, all-consuming obsession: killing Bart Simpson. He has tried to do it many, many times over the years. He's wielded knives, explosives, an actual airship at one point. His hatred for Bart is real and articulate, and frankly, a bit much for a grown man to direct at a child. He should be one of the scariest characters on television, and instead he keeps stepping on rakes. He's foiled almost every single time, usually by his own theatricality, his inability to just get on with the murder instead of monologuing about it in iambic pentameter. So tonight's road is a dark little one, and we'll hold it lightly. What if one of the schemes had worked? What if just once Bob had managed to actually do the thing he spent his whole life trying to do? And the first thing to say is that the show would lose its best recurring villain and one of its central children in the same stroke, which is obviously unthinkable, which is exactly why it never happens. But the more interesting thing to me is why it never happens. It's not luck, it's character. Bob fails because of who he is. He's too refined, too in love with the drama of his own villainy, too committed to doing it properly. He could shoot Bart from a distance and be done with it. He sometimes does. He has to explain himself first. He has to set up an elaborate scenario, deliver a speech, savor the moment, and the savoring is always, always what undoes him. He gets so wrapped up in being a villain that he forgets to actually be a successful one. There's a wonderful bit where Bart, knowing this about him, simply asks Bob to sing the entire score of a musical before killing him. And Bob, because he cannot help himself, because his vanity is bigger than his bloodlust, does it. The whole thing buys Bart exactly the time he needs. That's Bob in a nutshell. His ego is the only thing reliably standing between Bart and a knife, and his ego has never once let him down, in the sense that it has never once let him win. So a timeline where Bob succeeds is a timeline where Bob stopped being Bob, where he became efficient, cold, quiet, got the job done without the flourish. And honestly, I don't think that man exists. The flourish isn't a flaw in Bob's villainy, it is Bob's villainy. Strip it away and you don't have a more dangerous Sideshow Bob, you have a different person wearing his enormous feet. The incompetence and the menace aren't intention, they're the same thing. He's dangerous because he's brilliant and obsessive, and he's harmless because he's brilliant and obsessive in a way that always trips over its own grandeur. Like a rake, you might say. He keeps stepping on himself. What I find genuinely lovely about Bob is that you root for him a bit, even though his goal is monstrous. You don't want him to win, God, no, but you're glad he keeps turning up, you enjoy his company, you'd happily listen to him recite Gilbert and Sullivan for an hour. He's a villain you'd invite to dinner on the firm condition that the children eat elsewhere. And the show knows this and plays it beautifully, giving him these long stretches where he's almost sympathetic, a cultured man driven mad by a town of idiots and one specific boy, before remembering, oh right, he wants to murder a child, and pulling you back. So the road where Bob gets Bart isn't really a road at all. It's a place the show can't go, not because of the rules, but because of who Bob is. He is structurally incapable of winning. His curse isn't that he keeps losing. His curse is that he's exactly the sort of man who will always, always lose in the most baroque and self-inflicted way possible, and will then dust himself off, growl, and come back to lose again. There's something almost noble in it, if you squint. He's the eternal near miss, the villain who'll never get there because getting there would require him to be someone smaller than he is. I'd rather have the rakes. I think somewhere deep down behind all that hatred, so would he. I want to tell you about the time Bart Simpson cried, because it doesn't happen often, and when it does, it tends to mean something. Right at the start of the show's second season, there's an episode called Bart Gets an F. And it's a big one in the show's own history. It pulled in something like 33 million viewers when it aired, which made it, at the time, the most watched episode the show ever did. But that's not why it matters. It matters because it's the first time the show took its little troublemaker and made you genuinely worried about him. The setup is simple. Bart is failing 4th grade, properly failing to the point where if he doesn't pass one more history test, he gets held back a year. And for once, the show doesn't let him wriggle out of it with a scheme. He actually tries. He gets the class brain, Martin, to help him study in exchange for teaching Martin how to be cool. And for a while, it's played for laughs. And as the test gets closer, Bart starts to understand that he might actually fail, that he might actually be held back, and the laughs drain out of it. He studies. He really studies. He prays in a scene that's funnier and sadder than it has any right to be. And he still walks into that test terrified, and he fails it, or he's about to. He gets a question wrong, realizes he's sunk, and he breaks down crying at his desk, not performing, not scheming, just a 10-year-old who tried his best and it wasn't enough, weeping in front of his teacher. And it's the crying that saves him in a way, because in his tearful babbling, he makes a connection to something he actually learned, some historical comparison about his own situation, and his teacher, moved, bumps his grade up just enough, a 60, a D-. He passes by the skin of his teeth, and he's so happy about a D- that he kisses the paper, and somehow that's one of the most triumphant moments in the whole show. So, the road. What if the tears hadn't worked? What if the teacher had held firm, the way teachers usually do, and Bart had failed and been held back? And it's a quietly significant little fork because so much of who Bart is depends on him just scraping through. Bart's whole identity is the cheerful underachiever, the kid who doesn't try, who coasts, who'd rather be clever about avoiding work than do the work. But that identity only holds together because underneath it, he just about gets by. The moment he actually fails, actually gets held back, separated from his friends, marked publicly as the kid who couldn't keep up, the cheerful part starts to crack. Because here's the thing the episode quietly reveals. Bart doesn't not care. He acts like he doesn't care. But put him in front of a test that actually matters, and he cares desperately. And he's terrified of being stupid, and that terror is the real engine under all the skateboarding and the prank calls. A held-back Bart is a more wounded Bart. The class clown routine works when it's a choice. It curdles when it's a verdict. A kid who's been told officially that he wasn't good enough, who has to watch his old classmates move up without him. That kid either hardens into something more genuinely troubled, or gives up the act entirely, and either way you lose the Bart we know. The Bart we know is buoyant, he bounces. He gets in trouble and shrugs it off and comes back grinning. That bounce depends on him never quite hitting the floor. Held back, he hits the floor. What gets me about the episode is how much it loves him in that moment of trying. The show spends years letting Bart be a menace, and then, right at the start, it shows you the thing underneath. A boy who's scared he's not clever, working harder than he's ever worked, and crying when it looks like it wasn't enough. That's the real Bart, the one the pranks are protecting. And the D- isn't really a grade, it's the show deciding that this kid gets to keep his bounce. That it'll let him scrape through again and again, year after year, because a Bart who fails is a Bart who breaks, and the show isn't willing to break him. So in the road not taken somewhere, there's a Bart who got held back. Quieter, harder, less sure of himself, carrying a small permanent wound about not being good enough. And I'm glad we don't live in that one, because the Bart we got is better than that. Not in the sense of cleverer, but in the sense of luckier. He tried, he cried, and the universe let him off with a D-. Most of us would take that deal. I certainly would have at 10 sat sweating over a test I hadn't revised for. He kissed the paper. Honestly, fair enough. There's a teddy bear in the snow. That's the image I want to start with. And it's the saddest image the show ever drew, and it belongs to the last person you'd expect. The episode is called Rosebud, and it's the show doing its own version of Citizen Kane, which is a wildly ambitious thing for a cartoon to attempt, and which it pulls off with a straight face. The teddy bear is called Bobo, and once, a very long time ago, it belonged to a little boy named Montgomery Burns. Not the Mr. Burns we know, the ancient, skeletal, sun-blocking tyrant who can't remember Homer's name. A small boy, poor but loved, living in a modest little house with a warm, ordinary family who adored him. And he had this teddy bear, Bobo, and he loved it the way children love the one toy that's truly theirs. And then a rich, cold, childless man came along and offered to take young Montgomery in and make him his heir. Offered him everything, wealth beyond imagining, a great house, a fortune, a future, as one of the most powerful men alive. And the boy had to choose, his warm, poor, loving family, or all the money in the world. And he chose the money. He left. And on his way out, clutched in his little hand, was Bobo. And as the carriage pulled away, the bear slipped from his grip and fell into the snow and was lost. And the boy was carried off to his new life of wealth and coldness without it. That's where Mr. Burns comes from. That's the origin of the monster. Not a tragic accident, not a curse, just a child who was offered everything in exchange for everyone who loved him, and said yes, and spent the next century becoming the hollow, grasping, friendless creature we know, haunted in some buried way by the one thing he gave up to get there, which is, of course, the whole Citizen Kane joke. Rosebud. The thing the rich man can't stop reaching for is the warmth he traded away when he was small. So the road tonight is the gentlest and the saddest of all of them. What if the boy had said no? What if young Montgomery Burns had looked at all that money and chosen to keep his family instead, and held on to Bobo and grown up poor and loved and ordinary? And the strangest thing about that road is that it erases the villain entirely. There's no Mr. Burns in it. There's just a Monty Burns somewhere. An old man by now, probably, given the timelines this show refuses to take seriously. Who grew up in a small house with people who loved him and became someone gentle and unremarkable. No power plant tyrant, no blocking out the sun, no releasing the hounds. The single most monstrous figure in Springfield simply never forms because the one decision that made him a monster never got made. And the show would be smaller for it, which is the uncomfortable thing. We talked earlier about how a town needs a shape for the thing it fears, and Burns is that shape. But Rosebud goes a step further and tells you where the shape came from, and it turns out the answer is heartbreak. Burns isn't evil because he was born evil. He's evil because he was a little boy who made the worst trade a person can make, swapped love for money, and then had to spend 100 years justifying it to himself by becoming someone who only believes in money, because the alternative is admitting he gave up the only thing that mattered for a fortune that never once made him happy. That's a genuinely profound thing for a comedy about a yellow family to put in front of you. It takes its cartoon villain, its sun-blocking, hound-releasing monster, and it says, here's the boy he used to be, here's the toy he loved, here's the exact moment it all went wrong, and it was a moment of weakness so human that you can't even fully blame him. Everyone wants the money. Most of us just never get offered enough to actually sell the people we love for it. Burns did, and he failed the test the way an awful lot of us might have. And it cost him his soul, and he's been the loneliest rich man in the world ever since. So in The Road, where he says, no, there's no monster, but there's also a man who got to be happy and held onto his bear and was loved his whole small, ordinary life. I find that almost unbearably moving, the idea of a kind, forgotten Monty Burns who never amounted to anything and never needed to. The show didn't give us that one, it gave us the tyrant because it needed the tyrant. But it had the decency to show us, just once, that the tyrant was once a boy who dropped his teddy bear in the snow and never got it back, and has been cold ever since and doesn't even fully understand why. The greatest monster the show ever made, and underneath it all, a kid who chose wrong. I think about that bear in the snow more than I'd like to admit. Here's a fun fact that genuinely delighted me when I worked it out. Homer Simpson is a Grammy winner. It's true, in the show's continuity anyway. There's an episode called Homer's Barbershop Quartet, and it's the show doing the Beatles, lovingly and shamelessly from start to finish. The story goes that back in the day, Homer was in a barbershop quartet called the B Sharps. Him, Principal Skinner, Apu, and a fourth chap who got swapped out for Barney partway through in a nod to the whole Pete Best business. And the B Sharps got famous. Properly famous. They had a hit. They won a Grammy for Outstanding Soul, Spoken Word, or Barbershop Album of the Year, which is a wonderfully specific made-up category. They were, for one shining stretch, the biggest thing going, and then it all fell apart the way these things do. The fame, the egos, the creative differences, Barney falling for an avant-garde artist and going all experimental on them, the whole arc is a tiny, perfect parody of the Beatles' Rise and Split, compressed into one episode. And it ends with the B Sharps reuniting for one last impromptu performance on a rooftop, which is the show recreating the Beatles' famous final rooftop concert, complete with a George Harrison cameo driving past and remarking that it's been done. It's a gorgeous bit of telly, honestly, warm and silly and a bit wistful all at once. So tonight's road is this. What if they'd stayed together? What if the B Sharps hadn't split and Homer had stayed a famous musician instead of going back to the plant and the family and the ordinary grind? And it's another one of those roads that quietly dismantles the whole show, but it does it in an interesting way, so let's follow it a bit. A Homer who stays famous is a Homer pulled permanently out of orbit, touring, recording, living the pop star life, increasingly distant from Marge and the kids, because fame in this show's moral universe is almost always a kind of trap. That's the thing I find telling about how the show handles Homer's many, many brushes with greatness. He goes to space, he becomes a famous musician, he gets rich, he meets the famous and the powerful, and every single time the story's job is to bring him back. Back to the plant, back to the house, back to the family, back to the ordinary. The show hands Homer the extraordinary roughly once a season, and then gently, firmly takes it away again every time. And I used to think that was just the demands of the format. You have to reset, or there's no show next week. But the longer I sit with it, the more I think it's actually the show's whole argument about life. The B Sharps episode isn't really sad that the band broke up, it's quietly relieved, because the band breaking up is what gave Homer back his family. The version of him that stays a star is a version that loses Marge, loses the kids, gets everything the world tells you to want, and ends up with the one thing the show thinks is actually worth having taken away. The rooftop reunion is lovely precisely because it's temporary, one last song for old times' sake, and then back down the ladder to real life. There's a deep streak of this in the show that I don't think gets talked about enough, and it runs through far more than just this one episode, but I want to come back to it properly later once we've walked a few more of these roads because it deserves more than a passing mention. For now, it's enough to say that the B Sharps had to break up so Homer could go home, and the show is quietly certain that was the right way around. So the B Sharps staying together is a road where Homer wins by the world's measure and loses by the show's. He gets the Grammys and the fame and the adoration, and somewhere along the way he stops being the dad covering a cruel plaque with photos of his daughter, the man who spent the air conditioner money on a saxophone, the bloke who left the best job of his life because his family was unhappy. He becomes someone with a much better life and a much smaller soul. I don't think the show would say it that bluntly, but it would think it. I love that the B Sharps existed at all, though. I love that there's a corner of the show's history where Homer was a star, where he stood on a rooftop and harmonized one last time while a beetle drove past, unimpressed. It's a lovely thing to have happened, and an even lovelier thing to have ended. The fame was real, and then it was over and he went home. And going home, this strange, wise show keeps insisting, was the better ending all along. I'm still not sure I believe it. But it believes it completely, and after all these years, I've more or less stopped arguing. Some places in Springfield feel permanent in a way that people don't. Moe's Tavern, the church, the school, and the Quickie Mart, open all hours, fluorescent and slightly grubby, with Apu behind the counter where he has always been, and you assume always will be. So it's a bit of a jolt to remember there was an episode where he very nearly lost all of it. The episode's called Much Apu About Nothing, from the 7th season. The town, in a panic about taxes, gets whipped up into supporting a local proposition, Proposition 24, that would deport all illegal immigrants from Springfield. It's the show doing satire about a real political mood and doing it sharper than you might expect from a cartoon. And it turns out, to everyone's surprise, including his own friends, that Apu is in the country illegally. His student visa lapsed years ago, and he simply never sorted it out because he'd built a whole life here and the paperwork felt like someone else's problem. So suddenly this fixture of the town, this man everyone's known for years, is facing deportation. And what saves him is, of all people, Homer. Apu comes to The Simpsons for help, and Homer, who, let's be honest, voted for the very proposition that's now threatening his friend, because Homer will vote for almost anything if it's pitched to him with enough enthusiasm, feels guilty, and steps up. He helps Apu study for the citizenship test. There's a lovely stretch of the two of them at the kitchen table, Homer being a useless tutor and Apu being patient about it. And in the end, Apu passes, becomes a citizen, and gets to keep his life. The Quickie Mart stays open, the fixture stays fixed, so the road tonight is the one where Proposition 24 catches him. What if Apu had been deported? What if the test had gone the other way, or there'd been no Homer to help him cram for it, and Springfield had simply lost him? And a Springfield without Apu is a Springfield missing one of its quiet, load-bearing warmths. Because Apu isn't a major character in the way Homer or Bart are, but he's part of the connective tissue, one of the dozens of people who make the town feel like a real place rather than a set. The Quickie Mart is where everyone ends up at some point buying overpriced rubbish at 2 a.m. Lose Apu and you lose a hub, a recurring warmth, one of the threads in the net. And you lose the friendship at the heart of that episode, which is genuinely touching. The unlikely bond between the careless American who'd never thought about any of this and the immigrant who'd built a whole careful life in the shadow of paperwork he kept meaning to fix. Now, I'd be dodging something if I didn't mention that Apu became, in later years, a genuinely complicated part of the show's legacy in the real world. There was a documentary and a wider conversation about the character, about how he was written, who voiced him, what the accent and the stereotype meant to the people who grew up being compared to him. And the show wrestled with that, not always gracefully, and the character was eventually stepped back from quite a lot. That's a real and serious conversation, and it's not mine to settle at 1 a.m, and I'm not going to pretend it away. But I bring it up because it's interesting how it sits next to this episode. Because much apu about nothing, whatever you make of the character more broadly, was actually trying to be kind. It was an episode arguing in 1996 that this immigrant was one of them, that the town was better with him in it, that the panic about deporting people was ugly and small. The episode's heart was in a good place, even where the character's writing, looking back, was more tangled than the show understood at the time. And that tension is sort of the whole thing, isn't it? A show this big, running this long, is going to contain both the genuinely warm episode and the genuinely complicated character sitting right next to each other, neither one canceling the other out. I don't think you have to resolve it tonight. I certainly can't. You can hold the fact that the episode meant well and the fact that the character became a real problem in the same hand, and just sort of look at both. What stays with me from the episode itself, though, is the smallest thing. It's that the town nearly threw Apu out, and the man who saved him was the same man who'd carelessly voted to get rid of him in the first place. Homer didn't deport his friend out of malice. He did it out of not thinking, out of voting for a slogan, out of treating a real person's life as an abstraction until that person was sitting at his kitchen table asking for help. And then, faced with the actual human cost of his own carelessness, he did the work to fix it. That's a very human little arc, and a quietly hopeful one. A town is made of the people you stop noticing are there, and sometimes it takes nearly losing one of them to remember they were ever a choice at all. The Quickie Mart stayed open. I'm glad it did. The light's still on in there all night, the way it always has been. Let's do a few smaller ones now, just to change the pace. These are lighter, and we won't linger on any of them too long. Think of it as flicking through a few more pages of the album without stopping to study every photo. Here's the first. What if Homer had stayed in space? Because he did go to space once in an episode called Deep Space Homer. NASA, in a panic about low ratings for their launches, decides to send an ordinary schlub up with the astronauts. And through a series of events that make perfect sense in the moment and none at all afterwards, the ordinary schlub they pick is Homer. And it goes about as well as you'd imagine. He smuggles crisps aboard, the bag bursts, the crumbs get into everything and nearly wreck the ship, and the mission is ultimately saved by an inanimate carbon rod, which then gets the hero's welcome and the magazine cover instead of Homer. There's an ant farm that gets loose. It's chaos. It's wonderful. And then he comes home, because of course he does, and goes back to the plant. The road where he stays, where Homer becomes a career astronaut, a man of the stars, is daft to even picture, and that's sort of the joke the episode is making. Homer in space is the show stretching its premise to the absolute breaking point, sending its most earthbound character as far from his sofa as it's possible to go, just to prove that no matter how far you fling him, he belongs back on that sofa. The funniest thing about Deep Space Homer is how completely it fails to change him. He goes to space and comes back exactly the same man. The universe itself couldn't make Homer extraordinary. He smuggled crisps onto a spacecraft. There's no improving that man, and the show loves him all the more for it. Now let's talk about Marge for a moment, because there's a road where she became a police officer. It's an episode called The Springfield Connection. Marge, fed up with feeling passive, joins the police force. And it turns out she's good at it, serious, principled, properly committed. And for a while it's great. But the longer she's a cop, the more it strains things at home. Partly because her husband is, let's be honest, a low-level menace to public order who does not enjoy being married to the law. And eventually she hands in the badge. The road where Marge stays a cop is a fascinating one because it's a road where Marge gets a self outside the house. That's the thing she's chronically short of, her own thing, her own purpose, separate from being the one holding the family together. The police work gives her authority, structure, a reason to leave the kitchen. And the show takes it away, the way it takes everything away, and sends her back to the domestic center because that's where the format needs her. But I always felt for the version of Marge who kept the badge. She was good at it. She liked who she was in it. There's a whole alternate Marge out there with a career and a sense of herself, and the show let us see her for exactly one episode before quietly folding her back into the apron. Of all the resets the show does, that one always nagged at me a little. She deserved the badge, and one more because I love it. What if the monorail had actually worked? Marge versus the monorail is, for a lot of people, the single best episode of the show, and the plot is that a charming con man named Lyle Lanley rolls into Springfield, dazzles the town with a song, and sells them a monorail that is structurally a disaster waiting to happen. Marge is the only one who smells a rat. Everyone else is too busy singing. And the monorail nearly kills everyone on his first run and is saved at the last second, and Lanley gets his comeuppance off in some other town. The episode is a near-perfect little fable about how easily a crowd can be talked into anything by a man with a catchy tune and a confident manner. The road where the monorail works, where it's a sound piece of engineering and Springfield gets a gleaming functional transit system, is a road with no episode in it, because the whole point is a disaster. But it's also a road where Springfield gets to be a competent town for once, a place where the big civic project goes well and the con man was actually just a salesman. And the show would never allow that because Springfield's incompetence is sacred. It's a town that will always buy the monorail, always sing the song, always learn nothing. And honestly, that's why we keep coming back to it. A town that learned its lesson would be a town you could leave. Springfield never learns, so Springfield is always there, exactly as you left it, ready to be conned all over again. There's a strange comfort in that. There's a strange comfort in a place that never gets any wiser. I said we were winding down, and we are mostly. But there are a few more I can't quite leave out because the album's thicker than I let on, and there are photos in the back I keep turning to. So here are a handful more at an easy pace before we let the whole thing go for the night. No need to keep track, they'll keep. Let's start with the future, because the show has shown us the future more than once, and in one version of it, Lisa Simpson becomes President of the United States. It's in an episode called Bart to the Future, where a glimpse forward shows us a grown-up Lisa in the Oval Office, the first straight female president, as the episode puts it, having inherited a country that's a financial mess from the previous administration. It's played for laughs mostly, but there's a real warmth in it. Because of course, Lisa ends up running the place. Of course she does. She's the smartest, most principled, most genuinely good person in the entire show. The one kid in Springfield who actually reads, actually cares, actually sees the world clearly. If anyone from that town was going to end up in charge of anything, it was always going to be her. The road where that future locks in, where we follow President Lisa all the way down, is a lovely one to sit with because it's the show allowing itself just for a moment to believe that the good kid wins. That the lonely, overlooked, too clever little girl with a saxophone grows up into someone the whole country has to listen to. And there's something quietly hopeful baked into the fact that the show keeps returning to versions of the future where Lisa has made good. It clearly believes in her even when the present-day episodes are busy ignoring her, sidelining her, letting her be the wet blanket who's right about everything and heard by no one. The future is where the show makes it up to her. The future is where being right finally pays off. But here's the bit I find touching and a little sad. Lisa's future presidency only exists in these flash forwards precisely because it can never happen in the actual show. She can't grow up, none of them can. She's 8 years old now and she'll be 8 years old forever, which means the brilliant future where she runs the country is permanently just out of reach, always shown, never arrived at. The show can promise Lisa the world. It just can't ever actually give it to her, because giving it to her would mean letting her age, and letting her age would mean ending. So she stays 8, gifted and unheard, and the presidency hovers out there in a future that will never come, like a kindness the show keeps meaning to do and never quite can. I think that's why those future episodes always land a bit bittersweet for me. They're not really about the future. They're the show telling its best character, I see you, I know what you could be, I'm sorry I can't let you get there. President Lisa is a promise the format can't keep. And Lisa, being Lisa, would probably understand the constraints better than anyone, and be quietly disappointed anyway, and pick up her saxophone and play something that says all of it without a single word. The good kid wins somewhere out ahead in a tomorrow that stays exactly 1 episode away forever. We talked about Ned earlier, the widower, but there's an older episode that goes after something deeper in him, and it's one of the most surprising things the show ever did with a side character. It's called Hurricane Neddy. The setup is that a hurricane tears through Springfield and, of all the houses, destroys only the Flanders home. Ned's, the nicest, most blameless man in town, the one who prays and shares and turns the other cheek about 400 times a day, watches the storm flatten his house and spare everyone else's. And the town, being the town, builds him a new one, badly, a shambolic, collapsing mess of a house thrown together by people with no idea what they're doing. And it falls down in front of him, after everything, and Ned snaps, properly snaps. The relentlessly cheerful, endlessly patient man finally cracks, and out comes decades of buried rage, at the town, at his neighbors, at Homer, at the whole unfair arrangement of his life, and he checks himself into a mental hospital because he's frightened of what's underneath. And the episode does something genuinely clever here. It reveals where all that suppression came from. Young Ned, it turns out, was a little terror, and his neglectful beatnik parents had no idea how to handle him. So they took him to a doctor who put him through an experimental therapy, months of non-stop spanking, basically, that taught him to suppress every negative feeling he ever had. He didn't become good. He became unable to express anything but good. The niceness was a cage built over a furious little boy. So the road tonight is, what if he'd stayed in there? What if Ned hadn't been coaxed back out, hadn't been gently rehabilitated by the end of the episode, and had simply remained the broken man the hurricane revealed? And it would unmake one of the show's most important quiet presences. Because Ned, for all that he's a joke, the goody-goody, the diddly-doodly neighbor Homer can't stand, is actually one of the few genuinely decent people in Springfield, and the show needs him to be. He's the moral contrast. He's the person who does the right thing so reliably that it becomes funny, and the show leans on that, both for comedy and occasionally for an actual conscience. A permanently broken Ned, a Ned who stayed in the hospital or came out hardened and bitter, is a Springfield with one fewer genuinely good man in it, and the town's already short on those. But what Hurricane Neddy understands, and what makes it more than just a gag about a nice man losing it, is that Ned's goodness costs him something. It's not free. It's not even fully natural. It's the result of a childhood that taught him to bury everything difficult so deep that he can barely access it, which is why when it finally surfaces, it comes out as a hurricane of its own. The episode is quietly asking whether the nicest man in town is actually happy, or whether he's just very, very well trained at seeming so. And it doesn't fully answer, which is the right call. It lets him come back from the brink, but it never quite lets you forget what you saw underneath. I think about that a lot, actually, with Ned. After this episode, and after Maude, you can't really see him as just the smug, perfect neighbor anymore. He's a man holding an enormous amount of pain in place with prayer and politeness and willpower, who lost his wife to a t-shirt cannon and his house to a hurricane, and keeps getting up every morning and choosing to be kind anyway. That's either the most admirable thing in the show or the most heartbreaking, and I genuinely can't decide which, and I don't think the show can either. So the road where Ned stays broken is a road where the mask finally comes off for good, And maybe there's a grim honesty in that version, a Ned who stops performing goodness and just lets himself feel the rage he was trained out of feeling as a boy. But I'm glad it's not the one we got. The one we got is a man who looked directly at his own buried fury, got frightened, got help, and came back out still choosing to be good, not because he was incapable of anything else anymore, but because he'd seen the alternative and decided kindness was still worth the effort. That's a better Ned than the unbroken one, honestly. The unbroken one was just trained. This one chooses. There's a world of difference between the two, and Hurricane Nettie is the episode that found it. Here's a strange one, and a sadder one than it first sounds. There's an episode where Homer becomes intelligent, and it's one of the most quietly devastating things the show ever did, and it's all because of a crayon. The episode's called Homer, and the reveal is that Homer's lifelong stupidity has a physical cause. There's a crayon lodged up in his brain, jammed in there since childhood, pressing on whatever bit of him would otherwise be clever. And when it gets removed, when a doctor pulls the crayon out, Homer's IQ shoots up. Suddenly he's smart, properly smart. He can do sums, follow arguments, appreciate things he never could before. He grows close to Lisa for the first time in a real way, because for once he can actually meet her where she lives, in the world of ideas and books and big questions. They bond. He understands his daughter. It's lovely. And it makes him miserable, and it makes nearly everyone around him miserable too, because it turns out that clever Homer is a worse fit for his own life than stupid Homer ever was. He notices everything that's wrong with the plant, with the town, with the world, and it eats at him. His friends find him insufferable. He can't enjoy the simple, daft pleasures that used to make him happy because he can see through all of them now. He becomes a man who's right about everything and content with nothing, which, if you were listening earlier, might remind you of someone else we met tonight, a man who grabbed some cables he shouldn't have. Intelligence in this show is so often a kind of curse. It's the thing that lets you see clearly, and seeing clearly in Springfield mostly means seeing how much is broken. So at the end, Homer makes a choice. He has the crayon put back in. He chooses to be stupid again on purpose, so he can be happy again, so his friends will like him again, so the world will stop being so unbearably clear. And the only person who mourns it is Lisa, because she's losing the one stretch of time where her father could actually understand her. He writes her a note before he goes back under, something tender about loving her even though he won't be able to keep up with her anymore. And then the crayon goes back in, and clever Homer is gone, and the dad who can't follow her thoughts returns, and that's that. So the road tonight is, what if he'd left the crayon out? What if Homer had stayed clever? And it's a road that, like a few others tonight, quietly ends the show because a clever Homer isn't Homer. The whole engine of the program is a man who blunders through life on instinct and appetite and love, who's too daft to see the consequences coming and too good-hearted underneath it all to mean any real harm. Make him smart, and you lose the blunder, and the blunder is the show. But it's the human cost of the road that stays with me, because a clever Homer is a Homer who finally connects with Lisa. And the price of that connection is his own happiness and his friendships and his ability to enjoy his one small, ordinary life. He couldn't have both. He couldn't be close to his daughter and content in his world at the same time. He had to pick. And he picked the world. He picked being happy and liked and ordinary over being clever and close to Lisa. And the show doesn't pretend that's a clean or painless choice. It's genuinely one of the more melancholy things it's ever shown you. A father choosing with full awareness to go back to not understanding his own child because understanding her cost too much of everything else. That's a brutal little trade dressed up as a comedy about a crayon. I keep landing on the same place with Homer, episode after episode. He's offered the extraordinary again and again, fame, space, a better job, and here, of all things, intelligence. And he keeps choosing the ordinary, and the show keeps insisting he's right too. But this one's the hardest version of that choice because what he's giving up isn't fame or money. It's being able to truly know his daughter. And he gives it up anyway because he's wise enough, even when he's stupid, to know which life he can actually survive in. In every episode after Homer has a crayon in his head, placed there by his own choice to be happy rather than clever. I don't know if that's the right choice, but I understand it. God help me, I think I might even make it. Here's a small fact that quietly explains a great deal about the Simpson family, and most people never notice it. The reason they have a house at all is that Grandpa gave up his. It comes out in an episode called Lisa's First Word, which is mostly a warm flashback about the family in their earlier days and Lisa learning to talk. And her first word after a whole episode of build-up turns out to be a slightly exasperated Bart, which is its own perfect little joke. But buried in that episode is this detail. When Homer and Marge needed the money to buy their home, the modest house on Evergreen Terrace that the whole show takes place in, Abe Simpson sold his own house and handed over the money so they could afford it. He gave up his home so his son could have one. And in return, in a detail that's somehow both funny and a bit gutting, Homer promised his father he could come live with them, a promise that, as we all know, ended with Abe eventually shuffled off into a retirement home, largely forgotten, visited too rarely. So the whole foundation of the show, the literal house, rests on an old man's sacrifice that was never really repaid. Which is a heavy thing to find, tucked inside a cheerful episode about a baby's first word. The road tonight is the simple one. What if Abe had kept his house? What if he'd held onto his own home and his own independence, and Homer and Marge had had to find somewhere smaller, or stay renting, or scrape by in some flat instead of the house we know? And it's a road that, more than most, makes you realize how much of this family's stability was borrowed from the generation above them. Because that house isn't just a setting, it's the still point the entire show revolves around. The kitchen where Homer tutored Apu and bought time he didn't have. The living room with the couch the family piles onto in every opening. The garage, the treehouse, the spot on the wall where the photos go. All of it sits on land an old man bought with the sale of his own life's stability handed over without much fuss because that's what you do for your kids. Take away Grandpa's sacrifice and you don't just change the address, you pull the still point out from under the whole thing. What gets me about this one is the quiet unfairness threaded through it and how ordinary that unfairness is. Abe gave up his house. He gave up his independence. He was promised a place in his son's home and got, instead, a bed in a home of a very different kind, visited on holidays, half remembered the rest of the time. And the show is honest about that. It doesn't pretend Homer treats his father well because Homer mostly doesn't. Abe is a running joke, a doddering old man whose stories nobody wants to hear, forever being ignored. But every so often the show reaches back and reminds you, this forgotten old man is the reason the family has a roof at all. He paid for the stage everyone else gets to perform on and then got shuffled off it. There's a version of this where that makes you angry at Homer and you can go there if you like. But I land somewhere gentler because I think the show isn't really indicting Homer so much as noticing something true about families, which is that the sacrifices the old ones make for the young ones are almost never properly seen, let alone repaid. Abe didn't sell his house expecting gratitude. He sold it because his son needed a home for his grandchildren, and that was simply more important than his own comfort, and so he did it. And then watched, mostly from a distance, as that home filled up with a life he wasn't really part of. That's not a tragedy exactly, it's just what so much love between generations actually looks like: quiet, one-directional, taken for granted, and absolutely foundational. So in the road where Abe keeps his house, the old man holds on to his independence and his dignity, and the family he did it for has a little less ground under their feet. I don't think Abe would take that trade, even knowing how it turned out, even knowing he'd be the forgotten man in the home he paid for. He'd sell the house again. They always do. That's the thing about that generation, the one the show is forever poking fun at. They gave up more than anyone ever quite noticed, and they do it all again without being asked, and the only thanks they really wanted was for the kids to be all right. The kids are all right, the house is still standing, Abe's still in the home, telling stories nobody listens to, and it's all built on him, every bit of it, even the parts that forgot. Let's talk about Krusty the Clown, because underneath the green hair and the cynicism and the merchandising, there's one of the sadder backstories in the whole show, and it turns on a father and son who didn't speak for years. The episode is Like Father, Like Clown from early in the show's run, and it reveals that Krusty, Herschel Krostowski, to give him his proper name, is the son of a rabbi. A serious, devout, scholarly rabbi who wanted his boy to follow him into the faith, and who was horrified when the boy wanted instead to make people laugh, to be a clown, to do the one thing his father considered frivolous and undignified, and a waste of a good Jewish education. And they fell out over it badly, and the rabbi disowned him, and they didn't speak for years, decades even. Krusty built an entire empire of comedy and television and tat, and the whole time there was this wound at the center of it, the father who wouldn't acknowledge what he'd become, and the episode is about Bart and Lisa, of all people, deciding to fix it. They take it upon themselves to track down the rabbi and reconcile the two of them, and they do it through scripture. Funnily enough, Bart digs up quotes from Jewish texts about the value of laughter and joy, and slowly the old man comes around, and at the end, father and son embrace, and it's genuinely moving. Two kids reuniting an estranged father and son who'd both spent years too proud and too hurt to make the first move. So the road tonight is the one where the kids don't manage it, where the reconciliation never happens and Krusty and his father go to their graves not speaking. And it would leave Krusty as something even hollower than he already is, which is saying something because Krusty's already pretty hollow. He's a wreck of a man, really, addicted to attention, drowning in debt, cynical about the very children who adore him, performing joy for a living while feeling very little of it himself. The reconciliation with his father is one of the only genuinely warm things in his whole life. One of the few moments where the performing stops and something real happens. Take it away and you've got a Krusty with no anchor at all. A man who gave up his family and his faith for a career that left him empty, with no one ever telling him it was all right, that the laughter mattered, that his father was proud in the end. What I find quietly profound about that episode is its argument that making people laugh is a holy thing. That's the case Bart and Lisa actually make to the rabbi, not that comedy is harmless, but that it's good, that bringing joy to people has real spiritual weight, that a clown can be doing God's work as surely as a rabbi. And the old man who spent his life believing the opposite comes to accept it. That's a lovely thing for a show about a cynical clown to land on. It takes its most jaded, broken, sold-out character and says, no, the thing you do matters, the laughter is worth something, your father was wrong to be ashamed of you. And the road where that never happens is a road where Krusty never gets to hear it, where he keeps performing joy for a living year after year with the one person whose opinion mattered most, still silent, still ashamed, still gone. That's a bleak little timeline, because Krusty's whole sadness is that he traded everything for the laughs and was never sure it was worth it. And the reconciliation is the moment the show lets him be sure, lets him know that at least his father came round, at least the wound closed before the end. So I'm glad the kids managed it. I'm glad there's a version, the real one, where the rabbi holds his clown son and means it. Because Krusty doesn't get much. He's not a happy man, and the show doesn't pretend he is. But it gave him this one thing, this one closed wound, this one moment where the laughter was finally blessed by the person who had refused to bless it his whole life. Everybody deserves at least one of those, even a sellout clown drowning in debt and merchandise. Especially him, maybe. He's funnier than his father ever gave him credit for, and somewhere in the version of the show we got, The old man finally figured that out. Let's do a lighter one to balance out all that estranged father melancholy. There's an episode where Homer deliberately makes himself enormous so he can work from home, and it's exactly as ridiculous and as oddly relatable as it sounds. It's called King Size Homer. The plant introduces a mandatory exercise program, Homer being Homer wants no part of it, and he discovers a loophole. If he qualifies as disabled, he can work from home instead of dragging himself into the office. And the specific disability he decides to pursue is obesity. He sets out to deliberately eat his way up to 300 pounds so he can claim hazardous weight status and stay on his sofa. Which he does with genuine dedication, treating the whole project like a training montage. He picks foods specifically for their weight gain potential. He's thrilled about it. And then he gets his wish and works from home in a moo-moo, controlling the plant remotely through a computer he can barely operate, propping a drinking bird toy over the keyboard to hit the keys for him. And it goes about as well as everything Homer touches. The drinking bird arrangement fails, there's nearly a meltdown, and Homer ends up having to save the day in person, lumbering across town to physically plug a toxic gas vent with his own considerable body. Which works, because of course it does. By the end, he's back to wanting to lose the weight, Burns offers to help, and the whole thing resets the way it always does. So the road here is a daft little one. What if Homer had never bothered? What if he'd just gone to the exercise classes like everyone else and never embarked on Project Get Enormous to avoid the commute? And I'll be honest, this isn't one of the roads that unmakes the show or breaks your heart. It's just a good window into who Homer fundamentally is. Because the thing that's so perfect about king-size Homer is the sheer scale of effort he's willing to put into avoiding effort. He doesn't want to exercise, fine, lots of us don't. But Homer's solution isn't to grumble and go anyway. It's to construct an elaborate, committed, months-long scheme to game the system, a scheme that requires far more discipline and planning than just turning up to the exercise class ever would have. That's the joke, and it's a joke about a very real human type. The energy some people will pour into not doing a thing when doing the thing would have been easier all along. There's something almost admirable in it, in a backwards way. Homer's laziness isn't passive, it's ambitious, it's a creative, scheming, goal-oriented laziness that treats getting out of work as a project worthy of his full attention. And the road where he just goes to the gym like a normal person is a road with less Homer in it, because that scheming is half of what makes him him. He's not a man who avoids effort, he's a man who redirects all his effort toward the wrong target with total conviction. Put a sensible path and a ludicrous one in front of him, and he will choose the ludicrous one every time, and commit to it like his life depends on it. I find that weirdly comforting, honestly, at 1 a.m. There's something freeing about a character who is this committed to doing things the hard, stupid way and being perfectly happy about it. Most of us spend our lives trying to be sensible and feeling bad when we're not. Homer just fully embraces the daft option and never once feels guilty, and somehow it works out. Or at least it resets by next week so the consequences never stick. The road where he's sensible is a road where he's a little less free, a little more like the rest of us, grumbling our way to the exercise class we don't want to attend. Homer didn't grumble. Homer ate his way up to it out of pure principle. You have to respect the conviction, even as you'd never, ever recommend it. We've walked a fair few roads now, and if you're still even slightly awake, you might have started to notice that they all bend in roughly the same direction. I didn't plan it that way. I just kept following the threads, one after another, and kept arriving at the same quiet place. So let me sit with that for a bit, because I think it's the actual reason a show about a yellow family has stayed in so many of our lives for so long. Almost every road we took tonight was a road where someone could have had the bigger life and either didn't or wasn't allowed to. Homer could have kept the bowling alley, kept the fame, kept the better job in Cypress Creek, kept the cleverness the crayon was blocking. Marge could have had the rich husband or the badge or the art. Lisa could have had the future where she runs the country. And in nearly every case, the show reaches in and gently takes the bigger life away and hands back the smaller one and somehow frames that as the happy ending. The dream job becomes the cruel plaque covered in baby photos. The Grammy-winning quartet breaks up so the dad can come home. In the episode, Homer puts a crayon back in his brain to become ordinary again, which causes him to lose his intelligence but ultimately strengthens his bond with Lisa. And over, the show chooses the ordinary and asks you to believe the ordinary was the better deal all along. For years, I thought that was just the format talking. You have to reset, or there's no episode next week, so of course everyone ends up back where they started. But I've come around to thinking it's something more deliberate than that, more like a worldview. The show genuinely believes it. It believes that the famous life, the rich life, the clever life, the important life are all, in the end, traps. That they pull you away from the people who actually love you, and that the people who actually love you are the only thing that was ever really worth having. It keeps offering its characters the extraordinary, like a test, and quietly cheering when they fail it. When they choose the messy house and the job they don't love, and the family that drives them mad over the shining alternative. That's not a limitation of the format. That's the thesis, and the floating timeline, the thing I keep coming back to, is what lets the show make that argument forever. Because nobody ages, nobody really leaves, nothing is ever finally lost. The town never has to live with the consequences of any of it, which means the show can keep choosing the ordinary again and again, week after week, decade after decade, without ever running out of road. Every reset is the show making the same choice one more time. Every status quo restored is one more quiet vote for the small life over the big one. The town that never moves isn't a flaw in the storytelling, it's the storytelling. It's a place that has decided permanently that the way things are is the way they should stay. Because the way things are is full of the people you love, even the annoying ones, especially the annoying ones. There's something else in there too, something about loss, because the one time the show lets something stay lost, Maud, knocked off that grandstand, it landed harder than almost anything else it ever did, precisely because everything else gets undone. In a world where nothing sticks, the one thing that sticks becomes sacred. And I think that's the show quietly teaching you how to feel about your own ordinary life, the one outside the screen, where things don't reset, where the people you love do age and do leave and don't come back next week. It spends decades showing you a world where loss is impossible, and then once shows you what it costs when loss is real. And the contrast tells you everything. Hold on to the people now. The town gets to keep everyone forever. You don't. That's a heavy thought to land on, so let me lighten it, because the show would. The same program that smuggles all of this in is also a program where a man gets repeatedly hit in the face by rakes, eats his way to 300 pounds out of spite, and plays his boss's bald head like a bongo drum on his way out the door. It carries its wisdom lightly. It never once lectures you. It just lives inside its frozen little town, making the same gentle choice over and over, choosing the ordinary, choosing the people, choosing home, and trusting you to notice if you feel like noticing, and to just enjoy the rakes if you don't. And maybe that's why this show, of all shows, is such good company late at night. Because it's fundamentally a comfort. It's a place where nothing is ever permanently broken, where everyone you're fond of will be exactly where you left them, where the worst day resets by morning, where the dream is always gently traded for something that turns out to be better. That's not how the real world works, but it's a lovely thing to fall asleep inside of. A town that never moves, a family that never ages, a man who keeps being offered the whole world and keeps, wisely, choosing his own small messy corner of it instead. I lied slightly about winding down. There are two more I genuinely can't skip, and this first one is about why Homer is the way he is, which turns out to be sadder than the show usually lets on. For most of the series, Homer's mother is just absent in the vague way that cartoon parents often are. And then there's an episode called Mother Simpson where she comes back and it reframes a great deal. Her name is Mona, and it turns out she didn't simply die or drift away. She was a 60s radical, an activist who got involved in sabotaging one of Mr. Burns's biological weapons projects, became a wanted fugitive, and had to go on the run to stay out of prison. She left when Homer was a boy, not because she didn't love him, because she had no choice, because staying meant being caught, and being caught meant being taken away from him anyway. So she vanished, and Homer grew up believing for years that his mother was dead, when really she was out there somewhere, hiding, unable to come home. And the episode is about her brief return. She finds Homer, now grown, and for a little while he has his mother back, this woman he barely remembers. And it's tender and awkward and lovely. He gets to be someone's son again. And then Burns recognizes her. The old warrant resurfaces, the authorities close in, and she has to run again, there. There's a final scene where Homer sits by the side of the road at dusk, having said goodbye, just looking up at the sky long after her car has gone, not ready to stop being her son yet. One of the most genuinely moving endings the show ever did, and it does it almost entirely without jokes, which for this show is practically a vow of silence. So the road tonight is the one where she gets to stay. What if the warrant had lapsed, or Burns had never spotted her, and Mona could have simply come home and been Homer's mother again? And it would rewrite Homer from the inside, because so much of him makes a quiet kind of sense once you know about Mona. The neediness, the way he loves his own kids almost too hard, too desperately, like a man terrified of losing them. The deep, bottomless want for approval, for someone to tell him he's done well, that he's enough. A lot of that traces back to a little boy whose mother disappeared and who spent years thinking she was gone for good. Homer's a man with a hole in him where a parent should be, and he's been trying to fill it his whole life, with food, with affection, with the family he built, with anyone who'll tell him he's a good boy. A Homer who got to keep his mother is a Homer with that hole at least partly filled, steadier maybe, less frantic in his love, less haunted. But I'm not sure he'd be funnier, or even, in the strange arithmetic of this show, better. Because the neediness and the desperation and the bottomless want are also where a lot of his warmth comes from. Homer loves enormously, messily, far too much. And some of that is the boy who lost his mom overcorrecting for the rest of his life, making sure the people he's got now never doubt for a second that he wants them around. The hole made the love louder. I don't know that I'd trade it, even to spare him the pain. What stays with me is that final image, Homer at the roadside staring up at the sky after she's gone, because it's the show admitting very quietly that some losses don't reset. Mona comes back for one episode and then she's gone again, and the hole reopens, and Homer goes back to being the man with too much love and nowhere to have come from. The town forgets, the way it forgets everything. But Homer, just for that one dusk, got to be a son again and then had to give it back. And the show lets you sit in how much that costs him. A man looking at the sky long after the car has gone, not because he thinks she'll come back, but because looking away means it's really over. I think about that more than almost anything else in the show. It's the most human Homer ever is, standing very still at the side of a road, being someone's child for the last time. And here's the last road before we let the night close over, and it's a fitting one to end on, because it brings us back to Lisa and to the saxophone, and to the first person who ever really listened to her play it. His name was Bleeding Gums Murphy, and he was a jazz saxophonist Lisa met very early in the show on a bridge, late at night, when she was sad and couldn't say why. He was older, world-weary, brilliant, and a bit broken in the way that great musicians often are in stories. And he hurt her. That's the whole thing. The saxophone we talked about earlier was always Lisa's way of saying what she couldn't otherwise say, and Bleeding Gums was the first person in her life who actually understood the language. Not her teachers, not her family, not the town. A lonely old jazz man on a bridge who listened to a sad little girl play and knew exactly what she meant. He became her mentor, her musical soulmate, the one adult who saw the thing in her that everyone else kept missing. And then, in an episode called Round Springfield, he dies. Lisa goes looking for him, finds him in hospital, has a little more time with him, and then he's gone, and she's devastated in a way the show treats with real seriousness. She grieves him properly. And there's a beautiful ending where she plays for him one last time, and his face appears in the clouds to play a final duet with her, which sounds impossibly twee when I describe it and is somehow genuinely lovely when you watch it. The show doesn't undo his death. It lets him stay gone the way it almost never does and lets Lisa carry the loss. So the road is the gentle one. What if he'd lived? What if Bleeding Gums Murphy had recovered and stuck around and been there for Lisa through all the years that followed? And it's a road I find myself genuinely wishing were the real one, more than most of the others tonight, because Lisa needs him. We've said it already, and I won't labor it. She's the most alone person in the show, too clever and too good for the room she's stuck in. Bleeding Gums was the one person who matched her, the one who'd have understood every later disappointment, every moment of being the only one who could see what was wrong. A Lisa who keeps her mentor is a Lisa with at least one person in her corner who truly gets her all the way through. That's not nothing. For Lisa, that might be everything. But the show, in its quiet wisdom, chose to take him anyway, and I think I understand why, even as I wish it hadn't. Because Lisa learning to carry his loss, learning to keep playing after the one person who hurt her was gone, is part of how she becomes who she is. He didn't just teach her music. By dying, he taught her something harder, that the people who see you don't always get to stay, and that you have to keep playing anyway into a room that might not be listening, because the playing was always yours, not theirs. That's a brutal lesson to hand an 8-year-old. It's also maybe the truest thing the show ever taught her. So in the road where he lives, Lisa is less alone and a little less herself. She keeps her mentor and loses the lesson. And I genuinely don't know which I'd choose for her if it were up to me, which is rare, because usually by the end of one of these I've made up my mind, but not here. I want her to have him. I also know she's stronger for having lost him. Both things are true, and the show lets them both be true and doesn't try to resolve it, and that's exactly right. It feels like the proper place to stop, this one. A little girl on a bridge, a lonely old man who hurt her, a saxophone passing the sadness back and forth between them. He's gone in the show we got. But she kept playing. You can still hear her every single week, that squawk at the end of the credits, the one that goes slightly off script. That's Lisa, still saying the thing she can't say any other way. He'd have liked that. I think somewhere in the clouds, he still does. I said the last one was the last one. It wasn't quite. There are two more small ones I want to leave you with, because they're about the two women in the house and the things they quietly set aside, and I'd feel I'd shortchange them otherwise. So Marge, there's an early episode called Brush with Greatness, and it reveals something most people forget about her. She can paint, properly paint. As a teenager, she had real talent. There's a lovely detail that she once painted a portrait of Ringo Starr and sent it to him, and the episode pays it off with Ringo himself decades later, still politely answering his fan mail and writing back to tell her it was good. And in the present, Marge rediscovers the talent, takes it up again, and ends up commissioned to paint a portrait of Mr. Burns, which she does, and instead of the flattering, powerful image he expects, she paints him as what he actually is. Old, frail, naked, vulnerable, a withered little man behind all the menace. And the town loves it because it's true, and Burns, to his credit, is quietly moved by being seen so clearly. So the road is, what if she'd kept going? What if Marge had pursued the painting, built a real life around it, become the artist she plainly had it in her to be? And it's another of those roads where Marge gets a self of her own outside the kitchen, and the show, having shown it to us, folds it carefully back away. We saw it with the police badge, we see it again here. There's clearly a Marge in there with talents and ambitions and a whole interior life that the demands of holding the family together rarely leave room for. The painting, like the badge, is a glimpse of the woman she might have been if she weren't forever the one keeping everyone else afloat. And the show lets her have it for one episode and lets it matter, and then quietly returns her to the center of the house where the format needs her to stand. What I find lovely about this one, though, is what her talent actually is. She doesn't paint pretty things, she paints true ones. She looks at the most feared man in town and sees the frightened, frail creature underneath, and puts that on the canvas without cruelty, just clarity. That's such a Marge thing to be good at. She spends her whole life seeing people clearly, seeing the hurt little boy inside Bart, the loneliness inside Lisa, the lost child inside Homer, and mostly she does it quietly, in the way she holds the family together. The painting is just that same gift, pointed at a canvas for once instead of at her own kitchen. The road where she becomes an artist is a road where the rest of us get to see what she sees. I'd have liked that. But I think she's been making art the whole time, honestly. It just mostly hangs in that house, invisible, in the shape of a family that holds together because she sees every crack before it spreads. And the very last one, properly this time, is about Lisa, and about one of the only choices in the whole show that actually stuck. In an episode called Lisa the Vegetarian, Lisa stops eating meat. Instead moves from a lamb at a petting zoo to a plate of chops that suddenly look like something she can't unsee, and it turns into a genuine moral stand. The lovely, unusual thing about it is that the show let it be permanent. Most things reset. This didn't. Lisa stayed a vegetarian for the rest of the series, decades of it, one of the few real bits of lasting continuity the show ever allowed, a small, quiet line drawn and never rubbed out. There's even a Paul and Linda McCartney cameo on the firm condition, apparently, that Lisa never laps, which the show honored. But the episode itself is cleverer than just Lisa is right and everyone else is wrong, because Lisa, being 8 and being passionate, starts out insufferable about it, preachy, self-righteous, sabotaging a barbecue, alienating everyone. And the lesson she actually learns isn't that meat is wrong. It's that being right doesn't entitle you to be cruel about it, that you can hold your convictions and still let other people hold theirs. She gets there through, of all people, the McCartneys and a surprisingly wise Apu, and she comes out the other side still a vegetarian, but a kinder one who's learned to stand her ground without standing on everyone else. So the road is, what if she'd caved? What if the pressure from the family, the town, the sheer exhausting weight of being the only one had worn her down, and she'd gone back to eating what everyone else ate for a quiet life? And it's a small road, but it matters more than its size, because it would have been the show teaching Lisa the wrong lesson, that conviction isn't worth the trouble, that it's easier to just go along, that being the only one who cares is too lonely to sustain. A Lisa who caves is a Lisa who learns to stop standing up, and standing up is the most essential thing about her. She's the conscience of the show. She's the one who cares when caring is inconvenient, who's right when being right wins her nothing, who holds the line in a town that never holds any line at all. Take that away and you don't have Lisa. You have another resident of Springfield going along, learning nothing like everyone else. That the show let her win this one and let it stick tells you it knew that. In a town built entirely on never changing, on resetting every lesson by next week, the writers looked at this one little girl and her one small stand and decided, no, this one will let her keep. She gets to stay a vegetarian forever. She gets to be the one thing in Springfield that actually changed and meant it. And I think that's the show's quiet love letter to her, the character it sidelines and overlooks and lets go unheard week after week. It couldn't give her the presidency, it couldn't let her grow up, but it could let her keep this one conviction, held firm, never undone. For Lisa, who gets so little, that's a real gift. She drew a line, and the universe, for once, let it stand. All right, one genuinely final road, a short one, from right at the very beginning of the show, because it's where a lot of what makes Bart bearable first showed up. It's an episode called The Telltale Head, and the title is a nod to the old Edgar Allan Poe story about a guilty man haunted by what he's done, which tells you most of what you need to know. Bart, desperate as ever to impress the older bullies, the ones who actually frighten him, decides to prove he's one of them by sawing the head clean off the statue of Jebediah Springfield, the town founder, that stands in the middle of the town square. And he does it. He sneaks out at night and takes the head, and then he discovers something he hadn't bargained for, which is that everyone loves that statue, genuinely loves it. The whole town goes into mourning. Even the bullies, the very kids he did it to impress, are heartbroken and furious about it, because it turns out the thing he thought would make him cool was a thing that everybody, including the cool kids, actually treasured. And the rest of the episode is Bart being slowly eaten alive by guilt, carrying this head around, hearing it talk to him in his conscience, unable to live with what he's done. Until he confesses and brings the head back, and the town, against the odds, forgives him. So the tiny road is, what if he hadn't? What if Bart had kept the head, or chucked it in a ditch, and brushed off the guilt, and never owned up? And it matters because this is one of the first times the show showed you that Bart has a conscience at all. Early Bart could easily have been just a brat, a one-note troublemaker on a t-shirt, and for a while that's how a lot of people saw him. But this episode, right near the start, quietly establishes the thing that makes him worth caring about for decades afterward. That underneath the mischief, he knows the difference between right and wrong, and the wrong genuinely eats at him. He's not bad. He's a kid who keeps doing impulsive, attention-seeking things and then has to live with himself, and living with himself turns out to be the hardest part. A Bart who keeps the head and feels nothing is a Bart with no conscience. And a Bart with no conscience is just a problem, not a character. What I like about it is how small and human the actual sin is. He didn't do it out of malice. He did it because he wanted, desperately, to be liked by people who scared him, and he picked the worst possible way to go about it, and it blew up in his face. That's such a recognizable kid thing, and honestly, such a recognizable person thing. Most of the genuinely daft, regrettable things people do, they don't do out of cruelty. They do them trying to be accepted, trying to impress someone, trying to belong. Bart sawed the head off a statue to get the bullies to like him and learned the hard way that belonging you get by betraying what everyone loves isn't worth having. So the road where he keeps the head is a road where the show's troublemaker never shows you his heart, and you'd have stopped caring about him years ago. The one we got is the one where guilty kid drags a stone head back to the town square in the dark because he simply can't carry it anymore. That's the Bart worth keeping. The bounce we talked about earlier only works because of this. Because under it, there's a boy who knows when he's done wrong and can't rest until he's made it right. He just needs a few episodes and a talking head to get there. So that's where we'll leave it. Not because we've run out of roads, we haven't. There are hundreds more. A town this old is nothing but roads not taken, but because the night's getting on, and some of these are best left for another time anyway. They'll keep. That's rather the point of the whole place. Nothing in Springfield ever spoils. You can come back next week and it'll all be exactly where you left it. I want to gather a few of them up before I let you go, not to explain them again, just to hold them next to each other for a second. A plaque that should have said, "You're here forever," and says, "Do it for her" instead, because a man covered the cruelty with photographs of his daughter. A teddy bear lost in the snow, dropped by a boy who chose money over the people who loved him, and spent 100 cold years regretting it without ever quite admitting why. A man standing at the side of a road at dusk, looking up at the sky long after his mother's car has gone. not ready to stop being someone's son. A little girl playing a saxophone on a bridge for the one old man in the world who could hear what she meant. None of these are jokes. They all come from a show that's mostly jokes. That's the trick of it, the thing I've spent half my life being quietly amazed by. That the silliest show on television kept smuggling in the most human moments it could find, tucked underneath the gags, where you'd only catch them if you were paying the right kind of attention. And the thing all those roads have in common, the thing we landed on earlier and I'll only touch once more, is that the show keeps choosing the small life over the big one, and keeps being right about it in a way I still half resent. Homer could have had so much. Lisa deserves so much. And the show keeps handing back the ordinary instead. The messy house and the difficult family and the job nobody loves, and insisting gently every single week that this was the better thing all along. The bowling alley would have been lovely, but he got Maggie. The fame would have been a thrill, but he got to come home. The cleverness would have let him finally understand his daughter, but it would have cost him everything else, so he chose to be happy and ordinary and a little bit lost to her instead, and wrote her a kind note about it and put the crayon back in. I don't entirely agree with the show, if I'm honest. Part of me always wants the characters to get the bigger life, the one they were reaching for. But I've watched it make the same choice for 36 years now, and somewhere along the way it stopped feeling like a limitation and started feeling like a kind of faith. A belief that the people who love you, even the ones who drive you up the wall, are the only thing that was ever really worth having. And that a life full of them, however small and chaotic and unglamorous, beats every shining alternative the world keeps dangling in front of you. I don't know if that's true, but it's a good thing to believe at 1 a.m. with the lights off, drifting. Wherever you are right now, I hope it's comfortable. I hope it's quiet. I hope the world outside your window is being kind to you, or at least leaving you alone for the night. If you drifted off somewhere in the middle of all this, then you're not even hearing me say so, which is fine, better than fine. That's the whole idea. And if you're still here, still awake, still turning these roads over, then thank you for the company. It's a nice way to spend the small hours wandering around a town that never moves, wondering about all the ways it could have gone and never did. They're all still out there, those other timelines. The Homer who kept the bowling alley, the Marge who took the badge, the Lisa who runs the country, the Burns who kept his bear. They're hanging there in the air over Springfield like they always have been, equally real, none of them quite happening, waiting for someone like you to close their eyes and wonder about them for a while. You did that tonight, that's enough. That's a perfectly good thing to have done with an evening. The town will still be here tomorrow, exactly the same, nobody a day older, the kettle still on, the lights still burning all night in the Quickie Mart. It always is, that's the comfort of it. So let it go for now. Let the roads rest. Let the whole frozen, daft, tender little town sit there in the dark where you left it, ready whenever you want to come back. Sleep well. Nothing's changed, nothing ever will, and somewhere out there a saxophone is still playing the thing it could never quite say out loud. Good night.